Hello all, I just am popping on to make a very quick video to share my tips for working into chains. This is one of those things that I really struggled with for much longer than I should. So I want to share two tips in this video. Firstly, I want to share my tip for working into starting chains. So I'm just making a chain here. I'll make about 10 or so. And then I also want to share my tip for working into chains when you're working within a pattern, because the way I approach it, there's two slightly different techniques. So I'm just going to share both. So how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Just going to make 13. So we can have a row of 12 stitches. So I've made here 13 chains. Now you can see that each chain is made up, you've got the kind of V like you have on a typical stitch, which is kind of on the other side, although I tend to make chains holding them like that, so it's sort of the top side. Now when you work into a foundation chain, so say you're starting, I don't know, a scarf pattern or a blanket pattern, you make a long chain and you are instructed to work into each chain. The way I do it, and the way that I think majority do it, but there's always different ways, is to work in essentially into the underside of the chain, which means you're going to have this side on the other side of the blanket. So let's just get a bit closer. Essentially what you're going to be doing is working into these humps here. So it's the single humps that you work in when you're working on a chain. Let's just show you. I try and keep in shot. Okay, so that is the last chain I made here. So I'm going to skip that, and that's going to be my turning chain. I'm not going to count it as a stitch. So with 13 chains, I'm going to work a single crochet into each. That's US terms. That'll give me 12 stitches at the end of the row. So this here is the first hump, so to speak. Back hump, bump, has all sorts of names. So I'm just going to work a single crochet into each of those across the row. Now you can see I've just worked 5 stitches there. You can see you've got the tops of the single crochet here, and underneath this is what the back side of the chain looks like. So it's really much it's a really neat way to work into it. So if you're making a blanket, this is going to be what the back of the bottom of your blanket is going to look like. So it's a really nice finish. If you're going to work borders on it, it makes it much easier to work into these stitches, because essentially that looks very similar to that. So I'm just going to work across to the end of the row, so continuing to work in these back humps. It's kind of key to not twist your chain, and when you're working very long chains it can be difficult. Your tension can fluctuate. If you find when you're working chains that you end up with a kind of curve like that, it will mean that your tension is too tight on the starting chain. So you might want to go up a hook size, or just try and drop your shoulders and relax. So this is hopefully number 12. That's the last one. So let's just get some more yarn. So that's my first row. You can see it's really neat. It looks good. So I'm just going to work another row, and then I'm going to show you what it's like to work into chains within a pattern. The other thing to mention, just before I move on to the next section, if you really do struggle with working into long chains and you find they look messy, I can't encourage you enough to learn the foundation, the chainless foundation stitch, which you can work with singles, half doubles, doubles, trebles. It's a really good alternative to starting a project. I'll pop a link here, and you get a lot more stretch with it than you often get with working into a chain. Okay, that aside, we're going to look at how to work into chains within a project. I'm just going to make 4 stitches, and then I'm going to chain 4 and work in the last four stitches. Just interrupted myself there just to let you know what I'm doing. But essentially, when you're working in a pattern, you might be told to work into a chain or chain space, and there's a couple of ways to do that. You can either work into the chain space, so I'm just going to chain 1 and turn, and then I'm going to work 4 single crochet, and then I'll show you what I mean. So here you can see I've made 4 single crochet, chained 4, skipped 4, and then worked 4 single crochet there, and I've worked 4 on the next row. So if I want to work into this pattern, I can either work my single crochet round over the top of a chain, or I can work into the chain, and each will depend on what pattern you're working. You know, so there's no right or wrong, it depends on the kind of functionality. But when you're working into the chain, you're essentially going to do the opposite of what you did on the starting chain. So you can see here, let's just give you a little close-up of this. This is the top of your chain stitches, which look very like the top of your single crochet, because essentially they're the same. So instead of working in the humps, you can see these humps are now on the underside. So you want to work into these top 2 loops of the chain to get consistency. And what that will achieve, as opposed to working over the chain like that, it will help your stitches maintain even spread. So they will be kind of anchored within each chain. So if you're doing something like fillet crochet, or in my new shawl pattern, the under the tree shawl, which uses this technique, it will just help the structure of the item. So just to reiterate the difference, so if I was to work around the chain, I would do that. So I've done that very loosely, but you can see the bottom of the stitch goes over that whole chain. That's not what I'm doing here. I want to work into these tops. So these are the tops. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are the bottom lumps. So what I'm going to do is work into these humps that were on the top, now on the bottom. Now it can be a bit fiddly, so there's a couple of ways to do this. Firstly, if you're working chains in a project with other stitches, keep your chains loose, because if you want to maintain a similar tension here as you've got here, you want to keep them relaxed, because it's very easy for chains to tighten up. So if you get stuck, you can kind of do it in this 2, you know, slip the hook under that one and then that one and pull it through, yarn over and pull through, which is a great way of doing it. But you can see this one, this little hump has pulled quite tight, so it's quite fiddly. So the way I find it easier to do is I just switch the chain upside down, work under the hump like I did similar, but then put my hook back under. So you can see my hook is under those 2 loops and the hump is on the base. So I yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through, and you can see there, that's the back loop. So let me show you that again. Again, as I say, you can kind of wangle it through, but you can see it's a bit fiddly. But it's perfectly fine to do it that way. If you find that way easier, brilliant. But the way I've found consistently easier, because you're only really putting it through one, is to put it through the underside hoop, and then you just turn it back. So that kind of movement, you've turned the chain essentially upside down, so you're just putting it back. That's the way I find it easier to do it. Now usually when you get to the last chain before, I'm just going to show you that in close up, before the stitch, it's a bit easier to just work under the loops. So you can switch betwixt and between. And again, there are the little humps. So again, if you do need to work on the underneath, one of the circumstances where you might do this. If you're working a top-down yoke garment and where you do underarm chains to split the sleeves and the body, you're going to have to work into both sides of the chain. So I tend to, when I'm working the body, I will work in to the top side of the chain like I've just shown you. And then when you come to work the sleeves, which is essentially, you'll be working like that, you can then really easily work into those bottom humps. I will link to a post I've got which has got a kind of photo example of that if garment's your thing. So I'll just work the last 4 single crochets to the end of the row. And there you see it. This is great for buttonholes as well, actually. That's just reminded me. I've got another post on invisible buttonholes for very simple buttonholes. This is a good way to do it. So I hope you found that useful. I'm going to link to another couple of associated posts in the comments. Please subscribe and follow for more tutorials.